Lois, could you give us an update on where school workers struggle in the States is at? Has the walkout movement continued, and what's your perspective for where that movement's been and where it's heading?
Well, I'm assuming that people know already that I think that the movement really began with the reform and the transformation of the Chicago Teachers Union and its strike in 2012. And then we have what I would call the second iteration of that process. After the transformation of the CTU, reform caucuses were formed in many other places. And I'm just going to say that the Baltimore Teachers Union has a reform caucus, Be More, and they just last week swept the elections of the teachers, not the support staff, the paraprofessionals, but of the teachers, and they won the presidency. And this is an extraordinary development that really has been underreported and underanalyzed, because the person who was the president of the Baltimore Teachers Union was the right hand of Randy Weingarten and is a long-time supporter of the Progressive Caucus, of the leadership machine. And she's in Baltimore. Baltimore is right next to Washington, D.C. So we have to look at what's going on in these large urban locals that are in the AFT and also in the NEA, and they are really, if they're not on the cusp of reform, they've already been reformed, many of them. So you have a reform leadership in Boston now, you have a reform leadership in Los Angeles, the second largest school district in the United States, Chicago, which is the third largest, Baltimore now, Seattle has a reform caucus that's very powerful, San Francisco has a reform caucus in name. It's all over. It's just Massachusetts, the entire state of Massachusetts now has a reform leadership, the state association. So I think it is really only a matter of time. And I'm measuring the time in a few years until we have a wholesale transformation of rebirth of teacher unionism in the United States. Now, all the places that I've mentioned are places where teachers have had collective bargaining. But the other thing that's going on, Oakland, that's the other place. Oakland waged this very important strike, in the city, Oakland, California. And there's supposed to be mass walkouts on May 22nd in California. Several locals in California. So there was a walkout organized in South Carolina, North Carolina. There's so much going on that it's impossible to name every single place. Tennessee. But I want to distinguish between different things that are going on that people have lumped together. I want to distinguish between a one-day strike, a one-day walkout that takes place when teachers use their sick leave and they turn what had been a lobbying day where the state affiliates of the AFT or the NEA had organized a few dozen people, maybe 40 people, to go lobby the legislators. And now what's happening is that in some places, activists, teachers, are forcing the unions, the apparatus, to make these mass demonstrations. They're using either they're using their resources to organize it, or they're not standing in the way when other people organize it. And it's very important that we understand that these mass demonstrations are not strikes in the traditional sense, right? They're more like political protests. That's really what they are. But the school districts have to close down because the teachers phone in, they use a personal day or a sick day. They used a sick day in Tennessee, for instance, and so many are out. The school districts have to close down, especially metropolitan areas. Okay, so that happened in Nashville, for instance. Nashville had to close down. So we have these one-day work stoppages, but even these one-day work stoppages, which are really political.
Do the demands vary from state to state?
Yes, they're really all about funding. They're about school funding. Very often people are saying we need more counselors, we need more support services for the students. They're about working conditions, they're about salary and working conditions, right? People are smart enough now to make sure that they don't just talk about salary, but they also talk about the conditions in the schools for kids. So every place I know of, this issue of support staff and counselors has been on the agenda, because the schools have been devastated. The financial cuts are always of counselors first, and support staff and aides and nurses, all the support personnel. And that's very important politically, though, because frequently those people are not in the teachers' unions. So it's the...
Are they unionized at all, or they tend
Well,
not to be?
but in these states, in some of these states, for instance, in Maryland, teachers have collective bargaining. But teachers don't have collective bargaining in Tennessee. And yet they were demanding teachers don't have collective bargaining in West Virginia. They don't have collective bargaining in Arizona. They don't have collective bargaining in Oklahoma, right? So what that means is that nobody has a contract, including the support personnel. And in most places, if there is a union that says it represents them, it is not the NEA or the AFT. Although in some places it is the NEA, right? So it varies from state to state and even from district to district. There's no, there's no rhyme or reason to it. So I want to make a distinction in these one-day actions. I think that's very important, that it's leading the way for a wall-to-wall union, or at least a wall-to-wall movement. That's extremely important, that there's solidarity there. But there's a distinction I want to make between the walkouts that are organized from the top, right, because you have a leadership that is now alert to the fact that members want this, and places like South Carolina or Tennessee, where they are forcing the leadership. They are organizing this themselves, independently. In South Carolina, the South Carolina Education Association had nothing to do with the walkout. So it really is, you have this phenomenon, again, this year, of rank and file organizing. So you had that last year in the walkouts, Red for Ed, the rank and file organizing, mainly on social media, and you have that again this year. But this year the difference is that some of the state affiliates, the apparatus of the union, has wised up, and they've shifted, and they're using their resources to organize these statewide actions.
In the areas where it's still characterized by rank and file groups organizing independently of the leadership, is the leadership tending to be dragged along, or is it being hostile and obstructive?
Well, South Carolina, they weren't dragged along. That's what I'm saying. They weren't dragged. There was no support whatsoever. They just sat out. Well, they're not going to last very long. I mean, that's the people who are savvier understand that they have to change. So we're seeing a transformation we're seeing these organizations really become unions. The rank and file, these rank and file movements, self-organization of the teachers, has made these, in many places, has made the unions act like unions. Then we have, though, I want to say in some cities, Denver was a very interesting strike. Denver was barely a majority strike. And it was a very important strike because it was a strike about merit pay. And both the NEA and the AFT supported merit pay tied to students' standardized test scores.
Right. That's like performance-related pay, right?
Like SATs.
Yeah.
Having your pay
Tied to your
students'
test results.
Results, right? And Denver was the first place where people voted. And the NEA sent scads of organizers in to persuade people to vote for their merit pay scheme. So this Denver strike was against that.
Wow. So it was a strike against a policy that was endorsed by the union leadership.
And then they voted for
right,
it.
Okay.
They voted for it. They were hoodwinked. They voted for it 10 years ago. It was a terrible defeat that people voted for this. The same thing happened, though, in Newark, New Jersey. AFT sent in, actually Randy Weingarten even came herself to Newark, and national union staff supported the local leadership, corrupt local leadership, to push teachers to vote for merit pay, right? Mark Zuckerberg had made this money available that he said was going to go to merit pay, which of course never panned out. And the teachers voted this new contract in. So Newark is still saddled with that. But Denver got rid of it, right? It's very, very interesting. The other thing that's interesting is that Denver is one of the few strikes, this is the other thing that's interesting about Denver, that professional development was a strike issue.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted the right to do teacher research for their professional development. In other words, they wanted to regain control, which teacher research then pulls the locus of control about what goes on in the classroom back to the teacher, right? It's a reprofessionalization of teaching in a good sense, professional control. And that to me was very exciting that they did that, because it was really a curriculum. They were using the strike to fight about a curricular issue. The same thing. So we're seeing the narrow scope of bargaining on bread and butter issues that the unions have been doing for the last 20 years. We're seeing that expanded and exploded, and that's extremely important.
Sure.
It really is. It really is. They're pushing against the constraints of the collective bargaining contract, and also the idea of what a teachers union fights about.
Yeah.
So I would say that is the most significant, I think. Those are the two most significant things that have occurred in the last year. The expansion of the demands, really a rethinking of what the union is about, and also the organizational transformation of the unions, of the apparatus, of the union apparatus. So there remains, I would say, there are two big dangers that I see looming here. One is reconciling electoral action, right? Both the NEA and the AFT are pushing the movement to focus on the election, especially the presidential election, but also the midterm elections. And it's counterposed to direct action. What's really interesting, I think, is that West Virginia has remained very focused on direct action. So what you're seeing is in the places where there's a more developed rank and file caucus led by socialists, or with socialists in the leadership, right? You see that electoral activity being used in a dialectical, if I may use that word, in a dialectical fashion with direct action and with mobilizations. right?
Mm-hmm.
So I would say West Virginia remains a model of how not to get sucked in to electoral action. I want to say UTLA, Los Angeles Local, I think has also done a very good job of not getting sucked into electoral action, but continuing with the organizing with communities. The other danger is, I think, the issue of building the union in the school. That remains a really big problem, is building the union and the base in the schools. Because these statewide or even these citywide strikes or job actions or mass protests, when they become the focus, the union isn't necessarily built at the school level about workplace issues, right? And that remains a very, very serious problem because union contracts where they exist have been weakened, and administrators really do what they want. Their safeguards are much, much weaker now. Due process is much weaker. There's a climate of fear in many schools that wasn't eliminated, for instance, in Los Angeles by the strike. It doesn't automatically happen that when you have this mass action or a strike, that's converted into building the base in the schools. And I think that there's a very some confusion, and I think a problematic strategy that says that building the union apparatus, a centralized union apparatus, so that you have building reps or chapter leaders who report to the areas and then report to the central office. There's not a sense that you also need building leadership that tells the union leadership what to do. In other words, they're representing the ranks. That idea of what we have is this idea that the union apparatus and union activists convey information and they do political education to the rank and file, but what we're missing is the other part of that the rank and file holds the leadership's feet to the fire. That is union democracy. I think that's a very serious problem, and there are people who are quite popular who are writing now about reinvigorating the U.S. labor movement and the teachers' unions, and they don't talk about union democracy. I think that's a very, very serious problem.
Okay, so you mentioned some struggles in the US around merit pay. There's kind of a sort of related issue for teachers and school workers here around testing, and as you know, the NEU conference recently voted for a strategy of organising industrial action to boycott testing in primary schools.
The standardized testing in the United States was actually introduced in the War on Poverty, in Johnson's War on Poverty. Why? Because there was a push to have some validation of whether the special money that was being given for schools serving kids in poverty, that was being used effectively, right? So there was a quid pro quo of getting the money versus having to demonstrate that the money was being well used, that is, kids were being taught better and were learning more. So you don't have that history. You don't have that history here. So the testing in the United States cannot be separated from the historic inequalities in the United States in education about race and class that are related to school funding and also racism. It cannot be separated. And So while the tests themselves are not valid or reliable measures of what kids learn, for parents who are looking for schools in which their children are going to be given a high quality education, the test seems to be a valid indicator of what's going on in the school. And in fact, it is. It is not of what a specific teacher is doing, but the scores for the school, right? Because they're bound up with parents. The strongest correlation for the test scores is parents' level of formal education. Well, if you put kids whose parents don't have much formal education in schools with kids whose parents do have a lot of formal education, the kids learn from the other kids. Isn't that right? So, in an indirect way, the test is measuring social class. And parents whose kids attend ghettoized schools with other low-income kids, with parents who have little formal education, they find sending their kids to schools that have higher test scores very appealing, right? So the issue of testing in the United States, I think, has a different meaning. It has a different meaning. Okay. The other thing that's different in the United States is that there's a very narrow, what's called what you can bargain about. When teachers won collective bargaining, curriculum, in almost every place, curriculum was given away. The unions gave it away. They won maybe the right to negotiate class size, hours, and that's it, right? So there's no vehicle that the union has within the contract, right? Having said that, when there was much of the ferment in the current movement was started by activists who did opting out of testing. But they were not people who were active in the union. That's the other thing that I want to say. That's a very different, the culture of the United States and teachers' unions was not to discuss these issues of pedagogy or curriculum, whereas in the NUT that has always been a very important part of the union culture and always also the union's demands. So what that means is that for the most part in the United States, we've had this bifurcation between people who are active on pedagogical issues and people who are active on union issues. That's what we have, and we continue to have it.
Okay.
So several years ago, when the opt-out movement was at its height in the United States, the Chicago Teachers Union supported a group of teachers in elementary schools who decided on the school level to boycott one of the city tests, right? But that took political education on the part of the CTU, the Chicago Teachers Union, to persuade other people in the schools to support them. So as of yet, we still, in the United States, we still have this dichotomy between people who are active on curricular issues and opposed to testing and people who are active in this revitalization of the teacher union movement. And it's a serious problem. It's a serious problem.
You talked a little bit previously about the question of building the union in the workplace.
Yeah.
And there's a slightly transformed landscape for doing that in education here because of the merger of the NUT and the ATL to create the NEU, which is significant for a number of reasons, particularly because non-teaching staff in schools can now join that union. So could you say a little bit about the question of industrial unionism in schools? What are those discussions like in the States? What's your view of the merger, and what do you think is the kind of path to building a genuine industrial union for school workers?
Well, I actually think that there are important lessons for the NEU and for about what's happened in the United States. Because I have never been persuaded. When I would talk to people in the NUT, they would say, well, we can't do certain things because we don't have, we're not the exclusive bargaining agent, right? And I've never been totally persuaded by that argument, that because I think that when you look at the texture of life in the school, right, the texture of life in the school, you're going to have some schools that are better organized, and you're going to have some schools that are not as well organized, and that includes people who are support staff as well, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that while the merger holds out the possibility of having a wall-to-wall union, which is what they described it, a wall-to-wall movement, which is what they described in West Virginia. They had a wall-to-wall movement. That's what I think the NEU should be thinking about. Not building a wall-to-wall union, but building a wall-to-wall movement. Because when you have a really strong movement, what happens is that the organizational lines of each of the unions it's not that they're eradicated, it's that they become permeable. That the rank and file workers at the site, at the school site, form relationships, and if that happens in enough places, they then force the district union to alter its positions. And that is actually what happened in the Los Angeles strike, the UTLA strike, is that the SEIU workers had the right not to cross the picket lines, but the district union didn't tell them that they had that right. In the individual schools, teachers told SEIU members that they had the right to support the picket line, but that they had to file a paper with the union saying that they were exercising their right under the contract not to cross the picket line. But the union leadership didn't do that. So in the schools where there were good relationships or strong bonds between the teachers, the parents, and the support staff supported the union and supported the strike. Are you following me?
Yeah.
So that they took everybody out. So I think that understanding this, that's the reason I think this term social movement unionism is very important. And I want to give Pauline Lippman credit for having clarified this for me, about the difference between a social justice union and a social movement union. And it was Pauline who said, well, you're really talking about the union acting like a social movement. And that's what I want to say. And social movements are not generally organized on a level of an LEA. They have to be rooted in relationships. So those relationships generally occur, maybe they occur within an LEA, but they also have to occur on a school level. So I would say that the challenge for the NEU is to develop wall-to-wall in the school, and actually outside the school if you have school bus drivers, a wall-to-wall movement, not to focus on the organizational issue, because the organizational issue is taken care of when there's a movement. You see, I think that's a different way of thinking about it, of thinking about the challenge. And then it does go back to that issue of building a rank and file movement in the schools. A rank and file. So if there's a rank and file movement in the schools, then that puts pressure on the other NASU UWT, that puts pressure on the NASUWT, because there are schools in which the NAS members are very militant. Isn't that right?
A small number, but they exist.
Okay, that's right. They exist. So what happens is that they become educated by the movement, and I think that's what we want to talk about. We want to talk about developing a water wall movement, not an industrial union.